The wolfsbane had to be measured down to the last grain. Too little, and her heart would not slow. Too much, and it would not start again. Orla had spent 3 weeks calculating the threshold, grinding the dried root into powder by candlelight after the rest of the pack was asleep, testing smaller doses on herself in the dark, with one hand pressed flat against her own chest, counting the seconds between beats. She had not let herself think about what she was building toward. Only the measurements. Only the numbers. She thought about it now, kneeling on the stone floor of the storage room, listening to the shouting from the great hall. Rolf's voice carried through 2 closed doors and the length of a corridor. She did not need the words. She knew what had been found. She had been careful with the archives. She had taken nothing, only read, and then, over months, carefully reconstructed from memory onto small folded pages she kept tucked into the seam of her left boot. Every name, every date, every wolf marked as transferred under what Rolf had logged as territorial agreements. The language was tidy. It was written to be read by someone who was not looking for what she had been looking for. She had been looking for 2 years. 114 entries. Her mother's name sat at the 43rd line, recorded as a voluntary transfer, witnessed and sealed and entirely false. Orla pressed her back against the cold stone and listened to Rolf's voice rise and fall until it stopped. Then footsteps, then a door, then silence, thick and deliberate. She had until nightfall, if she was fortunate. Less, if she was not. She found Tess in the washing yard behind the kitchen, working a length of wet wool through her hands. Tess looked up, read her face, and stopped. "Tonight," Orla said. Tess did not ask which plan. There had only ever been one. They had spoken of it 2 winters back, in the corner of the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed. The night Orla had finally told her the part of the truth that mattered. That her mother had not chosen to leave. That the record of it existed inside the building they were standing in. That Rolf knew what Orla had been doing in the archives, and that knowing was the thing that would eventually move him to act. Tess set the wool down across the basin's edge. She did not ask if Orla was certain. She had asked once, 2 winters ago, and Orla had answered her, and Tess had not asked again. "The box," Tess said, "ready since last week." "The dose?" "Calculated." Tess pressed her wet hands flat against her skirt and looked at Orla with the expression she had worn since the beginning. Not afraid of what was happening, but afraid of the ending she could not see from here. She was 22, and she was the quietest, steadiest person in Orla's 7 years inside this pack. She had never asked what she was getting out of any of it. "I keep the lid closed," Tess said, "no matter what anyone says. And if Rolf..." Grief. Overwhelmed. "You stepped outside for air and weren't watching, whatever fits the moment." Orla held her gaze. "You have never been a poor liar, Tess. Today, don't be anything else." One short nod. The kind that meant the decision had already been made, and this was only the confirmation. The coffin was plain cut wood, correct for an Omega with no family willing to pay for carving. Orla had arranged it herself 6 weeks prior, through the carpenter who supplied the pack's grain storage. He had not asked questions. She had paid with the last of the coin she had saved across 7 years of pack work, and when the transaction was done, something in her had steadied in a way nothing else had. She took the wolfsbane just before the first bell of morning in the storage room with cold water. Then she crossed to the hall, climbed in, and settled her hands at her sides. Tess lowered the lid. The latch clicked. The wolfsbane worked in layers. First warmth, spreading from the stomach outward. Then a heaviness against her ribs, slow and insistent, narrowing each breath. Her heartbeat began to stretch, the intervals between beats lengthening. She focused on the compression, the inward press she had practiced since she was 17. The motion that pushed her wolf's presence down and further down, below the threshold of sensing, below the range of any instinct, any nose, any alpha reading the room. The wolf did not resist. It had learned long ago not to fight what she was doing. 7 years of that particular quiet, what she did not examine, lying in the dark with the wood 2 inches from her face, was the other side of it. Every day of compression was pressure added to a sealed space. She had stopped thinking about what that sum had become. Outside, the pack gathered. She heard their footsteps through the wood, the rhythm of people assembled out of obligation, voices low and perfunctory, benches scraping into place. No grief in it. She had not expected grief. She had given them 7 years, and they had given her tolerance, which in Dunmore passed for belonging. She kept her eyes open in the dark and counted her heartbeats. Slower, each one further from the last. She heard him before she understood what she was hearing. Different footsteps at the door. Not the pack's irregular shuffle and drift. Something measured and even, with a weight to it that moved through the room ahead of itself. She felt the crowd rearrange without hearing anyone tell it to. She pressed her wolf down sharply, a reflex so trained it happened before thought. Silence fell in the hall. Not gradual, immediate, as if cut. The footsteps stopped. She counted. 1 breath, 2, 5, 12. He did not move. Her wolf pushed once against the compression, a short, hard pulse, and she held it flat. The wolfsbane was still running slow in her blood. She focused on the stone beneath the wood beneath her back. She focused on being nothing. He still did not move. 20 seconds became 30. 30 became longer than that. The hall stayed silent in the way a room stayed silent when the person standing in it commanded silence without speaking. Whatever his wolf was reading from the coffin, it was not giving him what he expected. She understood, without accessing the part of herself she was keeping locked, that he was not a man who easily accepted the gap between what his instincts told him and what his eyes could confirm. The sound he made was barely a sound, a shift of weight, a boot placed on stone, slowly, like a decision being worked out in real time. Not stepping back, not reaching for the latch either. Standing at exactly the point between the two choices. Orla did not breathe. The deciding stretched. Long enough that she began mapping other options. The knife at her boot, the exits Tess had noted, the seconds between latch and open air. Then the footsteps resumed, even and unhurried, moving toward the door. No pause, no deviation, no signal to anyone in a room full of people who would have acted on a signal immediately. The door opened and closed. The hall exhaled in one long collective release. She lay still for another full minute before she acknowledged what had just happened. He had stood at that coffin long enough to know that something was wrong. His wolf had told him something was wrong, and he had walked out without a word to a single one of Rolf's people. She did not know why. She filed it with the things she would think about later, when later was something she had access to, and she waited. The 3 slow knocks came an hour after the hall cleared. Tess's signal. Orla pushed the lid open on the 3rd knock and sat on the coffin's edge with her head down, riding out the last of the wolfsbane. Her heartbeat was climbing back unevenly, and the cold air in the hall was sharp enough to help. 2 torches guttered in their brackets, the light low and reddish. Tess stood at the far door, back against the wall, watching the corridor. "Who was he?" Orla said. "Riders came in from the capital just before dawn." Tess kept her voice low. "I heard 2 of Rolf's men talking in the yard. The phrase one of them used was, 'Alpha King.' I didn't get closer." Orla looked at the inside of the lid she had just climbed out of. The Alpha King. She placed the information in order and moved past it. It did not change the night's immediate work. Anyone else stay through the ceremony? Vane. Tess's jaw tightened. Side door, through both rights. He didn't speak to anyone. He had his hands folded in front of him, and he watched the coffin the entire time. What did he do when the Alpha King left? Watched the door, then went back to watching the box. A pause. "I don't like what his face looks like when he's deciding something." Orla had spent 3 days watching the same face. Vane had come to Dunmore as a treaty assessor, an advisor handling Rolf's negotiations with a northern territory. But Rolf's behavior around Vane was not the behavior of a man hosting an advisor. Shorter sentences? Less volume? The specific contained manner of someone reporting rather than receiving. And the way Vane moved through the restricted wing of the pack archives, that easy, unchallenged walk past the two guards at the entrance without acknowledging them, without being stopped. That familiarity was not 3 days old. It had not been earned here. She would think more carefully about Vane once she was far enough north that thinking carefully could matter. "Listen to me," Orla said. She waited until Tess looked directly at her. "Go back to the hall tonight. Grieve through tomorrow. Stay away from the archives. Don't let Vane's people have a reason to notice you. If Rolf calls you in—" I stepped out before the second rite. I couldn't stay. I needed air. Tess's voice was flat and practiced. "I didn't see anything." "That's the right answer." Tess held her gaze. "And after tomorrow?" Orla crossed to the pack she had cached behind the wood storage 4 days ago. Dried provisions, water, the folded pages secure in her boot, the knife at her hip. She checked each item by touch without looking away from Tess. "After tomorrow, I need you to watch what moves through those archives under Vane's authority. Documents going in or out, sealed correspondence, messengers he receives at the pack house instead of Rolf's hall." She straightened. "Don't take anything. Don't touch anything. Only watch and remember. What am I looking for?" "The authorization trail." She kept her voice even because the answer mattered too much to deliver otherwise. "Rolf signed the transfers. That's what I have. But someone in the capital issued the formal sanctions that made each one legal under treaty. That signature is what's missing. Without it, what I'm carrying accuses Rolf and stops there." She looked at Tess. "I need it to reach further than Rolf." Something settled in Tess's expression. Not relief. The specific steadiness of a person who has been given a task that is large enough to be worth the weight of carrying it. "I'll find it," Tess said. Orla moved to the servant's door. The wood was cold under her hand. "Orla," she stopped. "The Alpha King." Tess's voice was careful. He stood there longer than anyone. His men were watching him the entire time, and not one of them moved or spoke. What did his face look like? His back was to me. A pause. I saw his hands, though. They were at his sides, completely still, not the way hands were still when a man was calm, the way they were still when he was putting effort into not moving them. The gap at the door's edge let in cold air and the smell of wet earth and pine. Beyond the servants' yard was the tree line. Beyond that, the neutral roads going north, where pack law thinned the further from Dunmore you walked. Orla stepped through the door. She crossed the yard and moved through the gap in the fence and into the trees, and the torchlight of Dunmore fell away behind her. The dark between the pines was deep and even, and asked nothing of her. She kept moving. 114 names were folded against her ankle. The 43rd one pressed the heaviest. She walked north and did not look back. By the second night, the soles of Orla's boots had gone damp through. The path north was not a road. It was a chain of old deer tracks, shallow riverbanks, abandoned charcoal clearings, and narrow stretches of stone where no print held for long. She had mapped it over months in fragments, from overheard talk in the kitchens, from ledger routes, from the memory of grain carts that came in from border villages and left again before dawn. None of it had been meant for escape. She had turned it into one. She kept to the trees until the dark began to thin. Then she crouched beneath a fallen pine, pulled one folded page from her boot seam, and checked the ink by first light. Still dry. Still legible. She slid it back in place and pressed the leather closed. Her shoulder ached from forcing the coffin lid the night before. Her pulse still felt wrong from the wolfsbane. Slow one moment. Sudden the next. She paid attention to the ground and not to the uneven movement in her chest. When the sun rose high enough to strike the upper branches, she compressed her wolf again. It was never graceful. It was labor. Her body knew the motion now. Draw in, hold, push the presence down until every instinctive thread went taut. It made her teeth clench. It made the back of her neck go hot. The world dulled at the edges when she forced it too deep, and every time she did it, she understood more clearly why no one in the histories had described Sigma as a gift. She moved anyway. By mid-morning, she found the first sign that Rolf's men were out. A strip of bark had been cut from a birch at shoulder height. Fresh, the inner wood still pale. A marker, not for ordinary trackers but for pack hunters working in a spread formation. She did not stop to examine it. She stepped into the creek beside the trail and walked through the water until the current bent west, then climbed out where the bank broke into stone. He had found the empty coffin. Of course he had. What mattered now was not the speed of his anger. It was how fast that anger would spread ahead of her. He could not reach into the neutral woodlands without cause, but he could send word, a wolfless Omega, bound under a legal mating arrangement, deserted before transfer, return if found. It would sound neat in writing. It would fit the kind of lie men like Rolf preferred. She thought of her mother's entry because she always did when she imagined the official version of anything. Voluntary transfer. Witnessed, sealed. Her mother had fought so hard that the guard who hauled her from the lower yard had lost 3 teeth and part of an ear. Orla had been 17. She had stood in the grain shed with both hands over her own mouth and forced her wolf down until black edged her sight. When it was over, the yard had been empty, and the stones where her mother had braced her heels were marked with 2 long, pale scratches. Voluntary. Orla stepped over a fallen branch and kept walking. By afternoon, the pressure in her body had become harder to manage. Compression for too long made her limbs heavy. Release it too much, and every shifter within range would feel the shift in the air before they ever saw her. She had spent 7 years learning not to exist inside a pack. In the forest, the habit had become a pattern of timed endurance. She gave herself 100 steps with the wolf pressed flat, then 30 with it loosened just enough to breathe, then another 100. It held until dusk. At dusk, she heard the first howl. Not close, far to the south and east. Single note, answered from further west a few moments later. Not hunting cries for prey, positioning signals, men spreading through a search line and telling each other where the gaps were. Orla dropped to one knee behind a spray of thorn and listened until the wood settled again. Then she cut north and east, away from the line she had expected, and into rougher ground where roots lifted through the earth and the slope broke sharply toward a gully. It slowed her. It would slow heavier men more. That night, she slept for less than an hour in the hollow beneath an uprooted oak, with her knife across her lap and her hand on the seam of her boot. When she woke, she had dirt on her cheek and rain beginning in the leaves overhead. She welcomed the rain. Rain blurred prints. Rain flattened scent. Rain turned every branch in the woods into the same wet, dark shape. By noon, she was soaked through and shivering, but the search sounds behind her had gone wide and uncertain. She crossed a ridgeline, descended into marsh grass, and found an old trapping hut half collapsed into the bank of a stream. There, she wrung water from her sleeves, checked the folded pages again, and took stock. Food for 4 days if she was careful. 1 flask half full. Knife, needle, thread, no fire, no margin for turning back. She rested there through the worst of the rain and let the wolf loosen in small controlled increments. Not release, never full release. Just enough to steady the shake in her hands and clear her hearing. Water struck the roof in uneven bursts. Somewhere beyond the stream, a branch cracked under weight too heavy for deer. She rose at once. The second pursuit came at twilight. This one was quieter than the first. No signaling howls, no obvious sweep line. 3 men then, possibly 4. Pack hunters who knew enough not to announce themselves once they reached neutral ground. Orla left the hut through the rear break in the wall and cut through the reeds with her body bent low. She moved along the stream until the bank narrowed into a slit of black mud between rock faces. There she climbed, using roots and small ledges, and reached a shelf halfway up the slope where loose stone could be kicked down without much effort. The first man came into view with his head angled toward the ground, following sign instead of the shape of the land. She sent the first rock down. It struck the mud beside him. He looked up. The second hit his shoulder. He swore. The third larger stone clipped his knee and sent him into the stream. She was already moving by then, scrambling across the shelf and into the pines above. Behind her, one of them shouted her direction. Another voice snapped back for silence. That told her more than the words did. Rolf had ordered her taken quietly. Alive. The forest opened for 20 yards into a clearing churned by old wagon ruts. She crossed it, reached the far tree line, and nearly lost her footing as her left leg buckled under her. Too long. She had held the compression too long. Orla caught the trunk before she went down and pushed herself upright with a short breath through her teeth. Her wolf surged once, hard enough to blur her vision. She shoved it back, stumbled forward, and kept going until full dark gave the trees back their depth. She did not stop that night. She moved by the shape of the land and the pull of north in her bones, and the fixed thought she had been carrying since she climbed out of the coffin. The transcriptions were not enough. Names, dates, destinations. They proved Rolf had sold wolves under false treaty terms. They proved her mother had not deserted. They did not prove who had made the papers valid beyond Dunmore. They did not reach into the court. They did not explain why Vane had walked through the archive wing as if he belonged there. If she died with only those pages, Rolf would fall and someone else would remain untouched. By the third day, the wound to her shoulder had stiffened into a narrow band of pain from neck to collarbone. By the fourth, her throat was raw from swallowing cold air. She crossed 2 logging tracks, avoided one shepherd's camp at dawn, and stole an apple from an abandoned cart near a boundary stone carved with the old mark of the northern villages. On the 5th morning, she woke to hoofprints. Not fresh, half a day old at least. 6 horses, shod, 1 wagon, heading north. She followed the road long enough to learn nothing useful from it and left it again. Too open, too easy to watch. The 3rd interception came near sunset. She had seen the ravens first, 3 of them lifting from one patch of trees and settling further downslope. Then the silence beneath that movement. No rabbit scramble, no brush shift from smaller life. Men holding still. Orla turned at once and ran. Branches whipped at her face. Wet leaves slapped her sleeves. The ground dropped fast, too fast, and she let it take her, sliding the last 6 feet down a bank of moss and loose earth into a dry streambed below. She landed hard, rolled, came up on one knee, and heard them fan out along the ridge above. "Alive!" someone called. A second voice answered from the left, closer than she wanted. She ran the streambed north until it narrowed and dead-ended against a wall of broken stone. No outlet. The bank on her right rose in slick shale. The left was too sheer. She spun, knife in hand, and caught the first hunter dropping into the bed with his weight forward and one arm out, already reaching to pin, not strike. She slashed for the forearm. He jerked back in time to save the artery and lost only skin. The second man came in from behind him, broader shoulders, faster feet. Orla pivoted and drove her boot into his knee. He staggered. The first grabbed for her wrist. She compressed. Nothing happened. Her body was done. There was no room left. No strength left to force the wolf down another inch. The answer came from the other direction. Up, not full shift, not even close. Only a rupture through the seams she had held shut for years. Strength hit first, violent and immediate. Her fingers locked around the first man's wrist and twisted hard enough to rip him off balance. She heard the crack in his breath before she saw him hit the stones. Her teeth had lengthened before she understood they had. Her nails bit through skin at her own palm, where the knife hilt pressed too tight. The second hunter stared at her face for a fraction too long and paid for it when she drove her shoulder into his chest and sent him backward into the bank. The third one stopped at the rim above instead of jumping down. Good. Let one of them be afraid. Orla did not wait to see what shape that fear took. She sprang for the shale wall on the right, caught a jut of stone, hauled herself up with a burst of force that should not have belonged to the body Rolf thought he owned, and reached the top with blood slick at one knuckle and mud down both knees. A hand caught at her boot. She kicked free, heard the man below curse, and ran into the trees again. She did not look back until the slope leveled. When she did, there was no one behind her. Only the first wash of evening through the branches and the tremor still running through her arms. She slowed then because she had no choice. Her breath would not settle. The partial shift had not completed and had not fully withdrawn either. Her canines still ached. Her skin felt too tight across her shoulders. Her hearing came in sharp fragments. A beetle under bark, wing beats overhead, water somewhere east, then blurred without warning. She leaned one hand against a tree and waited for the world to stop pitching. Rolf's men had seen something. Not enough, not clearly, but enough to report strength that did not fit the story he had spent years forcing onto her. He would dismiss it if he could. He had no use for information that complicated his own design. That might help her. It might not. She walked until moonrise, and then slept on bare ground with no fire and one hand over the seam of her boot. On the 7th day, she reached the border village. It announced itself before she saw the roofs. Smoke from peat fires, the creak of a wheel in need of grease, a dog barking once and then again from somewhere near a byre. Small sounds, domestic and close, after so much forest. She stopped at the rise above the village and studied it. 12 houses, one smithy, one low inn with a sagging sign. Fields beyond, poor but turned, no visible pack markers on the outer fences. Good, neutral enough to trade with anyone, small enough that strangers would be noticed, but not so small that every face belonged to one bloodline. She entered from the east and kept her head down. By luck, or by whatever stood in for luck, after a week of hunger and cold, the first person who looked at her twice was a healer. The woman's yard was lined with drying herbs beneath the eaves, bundles turning in the wind. She was perhaps 50, broad across the shoulders, sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold. Her eyes went from Orla's torn sleeve to the blood dried at her wrist, to the way she was holding her left arm and stayed there. "You can either walk away from my gate," the healer said, "or step through it. Pick one before I decide for you." "I can work," Orla said. The woman's gaze sharpened. "Can you lift water?" "Yes." "Split kindling?" "Yes." "Sew without ruining the cloth?" "Most of the time." The healer jerked her chin toward the open gate. "Then come in before you drip onto the road and bring 3 kinds of trouble with you." Her name was Maud. She cleaned the cut on Orla's shoulder without questions at first. Warm water, sharp spirits. A needle passed through flame. Orla sat on a stool by the table and bit the inside of her cheek when the stitching started. "Pack trouble," Maud said eventually. "Yes." "Your own?" "Yes." "Do you intend to bring it to my door?" "No." Maud tied off the final stitch. "Good. Then you can sleep in the loft for 2 nights and earn it tomorrow." It became 3. On the first day, Orla carried water from the well and split wood behind the shed. On the second, she ground willow bark and sorted dried leaves into jars, while Maud saw to a child with a fever and an old man with a knee swollen twice its proper size. By the 3rd morning, the wound had stopped bleeding through the dressing, and she could lift her arm again without wanting to swear. It was in the middle of that 3rd day that she heard the first useful thing. 2 traders stopped in for salve and warm drink and stayed long enough to talk. Men always did when there was a table, and a woman working nearby whom they had already decided did not matter. "The king's men passed through 3 mornings ago," one of them said. "Took the north road rather than the river crossing." "Inspection?" the other asked. "That or court business, big party for inspection." Orla kept her eyes on the mortar in front of her and ground the bark finer. "How far north?" 2 days if the roads hold." Later, when the traders had gone, she asked Maud. "The riders from 3 mornings ago, the lead among them, dark hair, beard." Maud looked up from the linen she was folding. "You mean the Alpha King?" So it had been him. He bought twice the amount of dried fever leaf any sensible man would need for a road party, Maud said. "Paid fair coin for it, said nothing foolish, I approved." Orla set the mortar down carefully. Maud watched her for half a second, then went back to the linen. "Whatever you are thinking, think it through to the end. Men in authority do not become simpler because they are cleaner than the ones you left behind." Did he say where he was going? No. Men around him spoke of a forward camp north of the ridge. 2 days, hard ride, more on foot. She folded the cloth once, twice. If you plan on going there, do it before your pack's notice spreads further. Orla went still. Maud noticed. Of course she did. What notice? Orla said. One reached the inn this morning. Maud's voice stayed even. Fugitive female, bound under lawful mating contract, to be returned to Dunmore if found. Your description is poor. Your luck has helped you. Neither will last. The room narrowed, not from fear, from the brutal efficiency of the choice now in front of her. She could not go to the capital as named property. The first official gate would hold her, bind her, and send her south before any hearing was granted. Rolfe had moved faster than she hoped, and exactly as she should have expected. That left one path. Reach Harlan before the notice outran her. That night in the loft above Maud's workroom, Orla did not sleep for a long time. The wound in her shoulder pulsed beneath the clean bandage. Rain tapped softly at the roof. Somewhere below, Maud banked the hearth and barred the door. Orla lay on her back in the dark and thought of her mother in the lower yard. Then of Tess in Dunmore, still inside the walls she had escaped. Then of the coffin hall and the man who had stood motionless at the lid and gone away without exposing her. The order of those thoughts mattered. Her mother first. Always. Tess second, because Orla had left her inside the danger and called it strategy because there had been no other option. The Alpha King last, because what she needed from him was not rescue and not protection and not whatever her body had registered in that strange pause at the funeral. What she needed was jurisdiction. Enough authority to keep her from being sealed back into Rolfe's lie before she could put the missing pieces into his hands. On the 9th morning, she thanked Maud, left half her food behind in payment, and took the north track out of the village before sunrise. The forest changed as she climbed. Less marsh, more stone. Pine giving way in places to cedar. The road drawing nearer, though she did not step onto it. She moved parallel to it through the trees, watching for riders, keeping the compression shallow enough now that she could recover from the strain of the last release. Not full suppression. Short presses only, enough to blunt her signature when she crossed places where shifters might travel. By midday of the 10th day, the woods had gone too quiet. No birds overhead, no squirrel chatter, no loose movement in the underbrush. Human silence, deliberate and spread wide. Orla stopped behind a stand of young fir and listened. One step to her right, another ahead and down slope. Not the clumsy search rhythm of Rolfe's hunters. These men were patient, ordered, working a contained perimeter instead of a chase. She shifted her hand to the knife. A voice came from the trees before her, calm and level. Step out where I can see your hands. She did not move. Another voice, further left. You have 3 bows on you. Do not test the count. Orla looked once toward the narrow line of open ground between the firs, measured the angle, dismissed it. Too exposed, too many positions already set. She stepped out. 3 men became 5 as the trees released them. Traveling leathers. No pack colors worn openly, but the center one had the kind of stillness men acquired only under discipline and long use of it. His eyes dropped to the knife at her side, then to the bandage at her shoulder, then back to her face. You've been difficult to find, he said. Orla did not answer. He studied her another moment. Our king thought we should look here. The words settled between them, clear and final in a way nothing else had been for 10 days. North had reached her before she reached it. The camp was larger than she expected. Not a road party's temporary stop. A working settlement of canvas and timber set back from the track on a wide shelf of cleared ground. Cook fires in 3 clusters. A picket line for horses running the full eastern edge. Men moving between structures with purpose. 2 guard posts visible at the tree line, and a third, less visible, in the branches of the oak above the entrance. She counted what she could while the scouts walked her in. She was taken first to a smaller structure at the camp's north edge, where a woman with ink-stained fingers recorded her name, her pack origin, and the reason she had been brought in. Orla gave all three without embellishment. The woman wrote without reaction and told her to wait. She waited on a low bench with her hands loose in her lap. The scouts had taken the knife, left everything else. The records in her boot were untouched. She did not allow herself to feel anything about that until she had worked out whether it was an oversight or a decision. The wait was 2 hours. When they came for her, she was walked across the center of camp in full daylight. Every pair of eyes in the place found her without trying. She kept her head level and her pace even. The main tent was larger inside than the canvas suggested. A table running the length of one wall, covered in maps and sealed documents. 2 oil lamps burning despite the afternoon. The tent flap tied back to let the light in. The man standing at the table's far end had his back half turned when she entered. He did not turn immediately. "Set her here," he said. The scouts stopped her in front of the table. 1 retreated to the corner. 2 took positions at the entrance. He turned. Orla had formed some idea from Tess's description and the trader's talk. It had not included the specific quality of his attention. He looked at her the way a man looked at a problem he had partially solved and was checking whether the remaining pieces would cooperate. Dark hair to his collar, a full beard, close kept, eyes a steady amber gold, moving over her. Torn sleeve, bandaged shoulder, mud from the knee down, without the practiced blankness of a man managing his reaction. No performance, only assessment. He came around the side of the table. The mate bond arrived. Not warmth, nothing dull or gradual. It hit from every direction at once, pressure against the inside of her ribs, through the base of her sternum, up the back of her throat. Her wolf did not rise to meet it gently. Her wolf drove into the seal she had maintained for 7 years with the force of something that had been waiting for an opening and had found one. She clenched her teeth and held the compression hard. Her vision thinned at the edges for a single breath. He had stopped walking. 2 feet from her, completely still. The amber eyes were no longer assessing. They were turned inward for 1 moment, not absent, not far, but gone somewhere the camp around them could not reach. Then they came back. He breathed once through his nose, slow and even, and looked at her. Neither spoke. The scout in the corner cleared his throat. "Sit," Harlan said. She sat. He returned to his side of the table. He stood rather than sitting. A choice. She noted it. Orla of Dunmore. The words came out flat, not hostile, but stripped. Claimed under a legal mating bond, witnessed and sealed by Alpha Rolf. Your coffin was empty by the 2nd morning. You have been traveling neutral ground for 10 days. He placed both hands on the table. Give me a reason that isn't the one Rolf is telling. The bond was fabricated, she said. Vane's name appears on a document Rolf produced the same night I was found in the restricted archive. No ceremony, no consent recorded. The paperwork is 3 days old, and I have been in that pack for 7 years. You said restricted archive. Yes? What were you doing there? She reached into her boot without asking permission. One of the entrance scouts moved. Harlan raised 2 fingers, and the man stopped. She spread the folded pages across the table. He did not touch them immediately. He read from a distance first. 114 entries, she said. Wolves recorded as voluntary transfers under territorial agreements. I checked the names against departure records, death records, and family accounts across the same 4-year period. 21 names appear in the ledger with no corresponding record of any kind. They are simply gone. The pack identifiers listed as destinations do not match any known territory under their official names. He lifted 1 page, set it down, lifted another. My mother is the 43rd entry, she said. Recorded as voluntary. He looked up. I was 17, she said. I was there. Something shifted in the line of his jaw. He looked at the page for a moment longer, then at the spread of them on the table. You have transactions, he said. Dates, names, amounts. Yes, but not the authorization. He straightened. These transfers are illegal under treaty without formal sanction from the capital. A sealed endorsement. Without it, this accuses Rolf and stops at Rolf. He looked at her directly. With it, someone in my court signed off on every one of these. I know what's missing. Do you know where it is? Inside the pack house, in the correspondence files Rolf handles personally. I could not carry those documents out without being found. I needed to leave first and reach you second. She held his gaze. That was always the order. He moved to the tent's open flap and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the camp. She waited. Her wolf had pressed back into the sealed space but had not settled. She was aware of him at 12 feet, the way she was aware of coming weather. Not through intent, but through something older. By treaty, he said without turning. I am obligated to begin return proceedings within 3 days of capturing any fugitive under a declared mating bond. If by then, what you have shown me is enough to justify sealed review, I can hold you under investigative authority while the case is built. You understand that? Yes. You have 3 days. He turned. 3 days of proof I can put in front of a council and hold there. I'll need access to your records on Dunmore. You'll have it. And a communication channel kept out of your main council. He was quiet. One of your counselors has been in correspondence with Rolf, she said. I don't have the name yet. I'm telling you because you should know before you decide what to share and with whom. He studied her. Granted, he said. The days built without the cleanness of progress. She was given a small tent near the records keeper and the camp's 2 junior clerks. Technically, custody. She did not try the perimeter. She had nowhere useful to go without what this camp contained. Harlan moved through the camp with the rhythm of a man who worked long hours and slept short ones. She became aware of his patterns the same way she became aware of weather, not by watching, but because her body kept informing her without permission. She tried to approach this as a tactical problem. It declined to behave like one. On the second day, he appeared at the records tent while she was going through Dunmore's supply correspondence from the previous year. He set a cup of something warm beside her papers without comment, moved to the other side of the table, and read his own documents in the same silence. They worked like that for 2 hours. When he left, she looked at the cup. Then she drank from it. On the third day, he asked why she had stayed in Dunmore 7 years rather than leaving earlier. She told him she had needed time and access. He received this without expression. She could see clearly that he knew it was not the full answer. He did not push for the rest. That bothered her more than being pushed would have. On the 5th day, they were briefly side by side on the narrow cut between tents, and the bond came forward again, a short, hard pull at the base of her sternum. She stepped sideways without looking at him. He said nothing. That evening, she made an arithmetic error in a column she had already calculated correctly twice. On the 4th evening, a sealed order had gone out under Harlan's authority, spare in language and narrow in scope. Temporary evidentiary hold pending review of suspected treaty fraud. No public accusation. No wider notice than the minimum required. It was enough to keep Dunmore's claim from attaching cleanly to her while the inquiry was still taking shape. 2 days had passed since his original deadline, and neither of them had mentioned it. She was working on the 6th evening when she gave up on the column and went to sit outside. The fire had burned low. The camp had gone quiet around its edges. She thought of her mother, not as motivation, not as the engine of 2 years of careful, dangerous work. In a smaller and less useful way, the angle of her mother's face when she was trying not to cry, which was different from the angle of it when she had stopped trying. The way Orla held her own jaw the same way. She had seen it in still water once, and it had startled her. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. She recognized the pace now. He stopped nearby without crowding. You didn't sleep last night, he said. I sleep in pieces. You haven't since you arrived. She looked at the low fire. Why did you walk out of the funeral? A pause. My wolf told me something was wrong. His voice was even. I believed it. That's all. You were in a sealed coffin in a room full of people who would have acted on whatever I did next. Opening it or reporting it, both ended in the same place. He was quiet a moment. So, I walked out. You didn't know me. No. The camp breathed around them. Cold air off the high ground, pine resin and ash. 7 years, she said. The whole time I had enough to bring a case against Rolf. What I couldn't find were the capital sanctions. The ones that meant someone inside your court had looked at those ledger entries and signed his name to them. She pressed 2 fingers against the bandage at her shoulder, then lowered her hand. I could not leave until I had a chain long enough to reach both ends. If I had left with only what I had at year 2, Rolf falls, and whoever authorized the sanctions stays clean. He was quiet. The 43rd entry, she said. My mother. She was 43 years old. She had red hair. She could not be frightened into silence, and that was the problem. She looked at the coal edge of the fire. The record says she left willingly. It is the most efficiently written lie I have ever read. Nothing moved in the camp. I'm sorry, Harlan said. No ceremony in it. Not the phrase men use to move past something. She did not answer. She did not need to. The 16th day broke cold. Orla was in the records tent before the clerks arrived. She had almost everything except the name. There was a pattern to it, an irregularity in how Dunmore's treaty submissions had been routed through the capital, always through the same approval channel instead of the standard rotation. But the name logged on the approvals had been written under a position title, not a personal seal, and the position had changed holders twice in 4 years. She was cross-referencing appointment records when the sound reached her from the south entrance. Voices moving quickly. Boots on hard ground. She stayed at the table. 20 minutes later, Harlan appeared in the tent entrance. Come, he said. The intercepted messenger was young, barely pack age, sitting in the center of the main tent with 2 guards on either side. On the table in front of him sat a sealed letter with a wax impression she recognized, Rolf's outer seal, and beside it the broken inner seal of the letter's actual recipient. She moved to the table and studied the inner wax. A small device, 2 horizontal lines with a mark between them indicating a court position. Second-level counsel, administrative appointment, not hereditary. She cross-referenced it against the routing irregularity she had been building in her head for 6 days. Counselor Davin, she said. Harlan looked at her. He has held the administrative post for treaty correspondence routing for 3 years. He was appointed the same month the anomalies in Dunmore's submission pattern begin. She kept her voice level. He is not the architect. He is the channel, the one who makes the paperwork clean and routes it through the capital without it surfacing for review. That is his specific function in this. She looked up from the seal. And now we have his name on Rolf's letter. Harlan turned to the head of his guard. Davin's correspondence, everything we carry for the last 4 years, sealed now, handled by no one who has worked with him directly. The orders moved through the tent and out of it. Orla stayed where she was until the messenger had been held and the record sealed and the camp's motion had settled around its new center. When they were alone, Harlan came to stand at the table's other side. Your status, he said. She looked at him. You are no longer a fugitive under a mating bond. He said it with the same directness he used for everything that mattered. You are a witness and a source in an active investigation under the authority of this office. The instrument I would have used to return you no longer applies. And the record's still inside the pack house. That is why we are moving. He straightened. 2 days. You travel with the column as intelligence source. Formal designation. What you do within that function is your decision. She looked at him across the table. Afternoon light through the canvas. The smell of pine and sealed documents and the particular cold of high camp. 7 years of deciding what to trust based on what she could verify. She had been wrong about nothing that cost her the work. She did not know what to do with a man who had stood at her coffin and then handed her tools. 2 days, she said. He left. She looked down at the papers still spread before her. Davin's name now sat at the center of the chain she had been building since she was 17 years old. The link was almost closed. Outside the tent, the camp had already begun to turn toward what was coming. Horses assessed, supply counts underway. the shape of 2 days from now already visible inside the motion of this afternoon. She thought of Tess inside Dunmore's walls, watching, holding the part of this she had left behind. She pressed the folded pages flat with her palm and kept working. The column moved south. 11 mounted men in riding leathers, no banners, no formal livery on display. A traveling inspection party, nothing in the arrangement to suggest urgency or confrontation. Harlan had designed it that way. Banners announced purpose. A quiet column only announced arrival. Orla rode toward the middle, on a brown horse with a calm temperament that the camp's stable hand had selected without being asked to find something manageable. She had not ridden much in 7 years. Pack Omega women did not receive horses. She sat the saddle stiffly the first morning and said nothing about it, and by the third day, the stiffness had resolved into something functional. The road south ran through cedar forest and then opened into lower farmland, broad and flat and pale with late-season frost. Villages at intervals, grain stores visible from the road. The land between Harlan's forward camp and the edge of Dunmore's territory was close to 2 weeks at a measured pace, less if the column pushed. They did not push. Harlan had given Rolf no formal notice, which was his right under the inspection charter. Surprise was not aggression. He arrived as the Alpha King's authority always arrived, as something that had already happened before anyone could prepare for it. Orla kept track of what she could from the center of the column, the shape of the land, the shift in the tree lines as the territory grew more familiar, the way the air changed faintly, the further south they moved. She kept her wolf on a loose hold, not the 7-year compression, something shorter. She pulled it in when they passed through a village or stopped near a crossroads where other travelers might carry news back to the wrong ears. The bond made all of it more complicated. It was not constant. That would have been easier to manage. She could have treated it as a fixed problem with a fixed solution. Instead, it moved in unpredictable intervals. Crossing a river on the second morning, his horse came alongside hers on the narrow bridge, and the bond arrived with an immediacy that drove the breath from her chest. On the third evening, he was 2 tents away, and she was aware of every small sound he made in a way that was specific and had no tactical value. On the fourth night, she lay awake too long and paid for it in the morning. She tried to examine it like a mechanism. Purpose, cause, outcome. It refused to cooperate. Her wolf had spent 7 years pressed into a space too small for it and had found in Harlan's presence the first thing it had decided to reach for. It did not ask her permission. The reaching was specific and constant, and she had not yet found a way to explain to the part of herself that operated on instinct that this was not the right time for it to decide things. On the 5th morning, he appeared at the tree line where she had gone to stand alone before the camp fully woke. "You didn't sleep," he said. "That seems to be your standard opening with me." "Because it keeps being accurate." She looked at the frost on the lower branches. "I'm thinking about the authorization records. How far into the restricted files Tess can reach from where she is." He stood beside her at a distance that was correctly professional, and that her wolf registered with annoying precision anyway. "Tell me what you know about Tess," he said. "She's been inside Dunmore since I left. She helped me with the funeral arrangements, which means Rolf suspects her and cannot prove it yet. If he had proof, he would have acted immediately." She paused. "She was Rolf's mid-level hearth staff before I knew her. She can move through the pack house without drawing the kind of notice I would have drawn." "Can she get to the correspondence files?" "The outer ones, the ones Rolf uses for daily administration, not the inner files where the formal authorization records are kept." She turned a pine cone over with the toe of her boot. "I told her before I left to watch what passed through Vane's access in the restricted wing. Sealed packets, messenger arrivals, anything moving through the correspondence rooms that did not fit ordinary pack traffic. Not to take anything. Not to take anything." She looked toward the road where the horses were being prepared. If she followed those instructions, she has a record of what she observed, not the documents themselves. Her memory of them. That's admissible under investigative testimony if I declare the inquiry formal before we enter Dunmore's territory." Orla said nothing. He heard the silence correctly. She's in danger whether we move quickly or carefully. The question is whether our speed helps her. The question is whether your spy problem has been fully contained, she said. You have Davin's name. You do not know who else in your column may be reporting. He was quiet for a moment. I have 3 men I would stake the column on. Outside of those 3, I have been limiting what information travels where since we left camp. How much does the column know about why we're going to Dunmore? Inspection, standard grounds. And Davin? Held at the camp under guard. The charge is sealed correspondence irregularity, low enough to keep quiet, high enough to hold him. She turned this over. It was tidy. She did not entirely like how tidy it was, because tidy arrangements had gaps. Someone is still reporting, she said. He looked at her. I don't have evidence, only the rate at which the situation has moved. She kept her voice level. Rolf did not send that messenger south by accident on the day we were reading the seal. He has been receiving information about this column's direction since before we left camp. Harlan held her gaze. She watched him think, not the performance of deliberation, but the actual movement of it, the moment where an unconfirmed suspicion met judgment and had to be weighed. I'll close the information further, he said, and accept that the remaining gap will close on its own once we reach the territory edge. If someone is sending messages ahead, they will act when we are close enough for it to matter. He nodded once, turned, and walked back toward camp. She stayed at the tree line another minute. Her wolf settled very slightly after he had gone. The absence of him was its own separate problem, and beyond that sat the older concern. Tess still inside Dunmore's walls, moving carefully through danger with nothing but memory and caution between herself and discovery. On the 7th evening, she sent a message to Tess. Harlan had established a correspondence route through a neutral carrier used for inspection business. Orla composed 3 lines in a script she and Tess had agreed on in the kitchens 2 winters past. Not a cipher so much as a personal shorthand. Laundry requests, the names of streets, the kind of domestic detail that passed through pack administration without drawing interest. The message asked Tess to confirm what she could reach and what she had seen. The return came on the 9th day. She read it twice in the records tent with the lamp close. Tess wrote the way Tess always operated. Steady, unhurried, precise. What she had found was not what Orla had told her to look for. It was larger. Vane had not limited his trips to the archive wing. He had access to the correspondence room off the main hall, which was where Rolf's outgoing treaty documents were formally sealed. 3 times in the past 4 years, Tess had seen him arrive with documents already drafted, which Rolf then sealed without reviewing at length. Rolf signed what Vane placed before him, the contained motion of a man approving rather than authorizing, not Rolf as the scheme's architect, Rolf as its executor. She sat with that for a long moment. Everything she had spent 2 years documenting had been built on the assumption that the chain began with Rolf and climbed upward through quiet protection, that the corruption originated in Dunmore and was tolerated at the capital. The reverse, that the capital had drafted the framework and Rolf had functioned inside it as an instrument, changed the scope in a way that had implications she needed to trace. Tess had noted one more thing. A ledger entry in Vane's hand, found in the outer files during a period when Vane had requisitioned them for a review that Rolf had authorized. The entry referenced payment disbursements for territorial coordination. The receiving account was recorded under an administrative title rather than a name. The position title matched Davin's appointment record exactly. The chain was complete. Orla set the letter down on the table. Not one man in the capital. 2. One building the legal framework. 1 receiving compensation for routing it cleanly, and Rolf, in Dunmore, doing what he was designed to do, providing the wolves. She had the architecture. She needed the physical documents to make it hold. She briefed Harlan that evening. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a short period, and then he called his 3 trusted men in, and the conversation became operational. She answered questions for 2 hours. The shape of the pack house. The location of the restricted archive relative to the entry points, how Rolf deployed guards during the day versus evening, which staff were directly loyal to Rolf versus ordinary household function. She had spent 7 years watching a place with the understanding that her exit would eventually require her to know it well. The planning took the rest of the night. On the 10th morning, they covered more ground than any previous day. Dunmore's territory edge arrived on the 11th morning, with the particular flatness of border ground. Not a wall or a marker, but a change in the quality of the air, the spacing of old growth giving way to newer planting, the land showing the marks of pack activity. Orla felt it before she saw it. Not from the suppression, from memory. 7 years left, marks that were harder to remove than any document. She held her wolf steady. The column entered the outer territory at midday. No challenge came from the boundary posts. 2 figures appeared on a rise to the east and did not approach. Rolf would know within the hour. On the 14th day, a rider appeared on the track ahead. Young. Pack colors this time. Rolf's first formal response to the column's presence. Not a challenge, a query. What was the nature of the inspection? What was required of the pack in preparation? All the correct language of a pack hosting the Alpha King's review. Harlan dictated his reply through his senior man without stopping the column. They would arrive at the pack house on the following day. Standard access for an inspection of this kind. No preparation required or desired. Orla rode with the message and its implications settling around her. Rolf was buying hours. She knew what an extra day inside the archive would allow him to do. She went to Harlan at the head of the column. He looked at her face and slowed his horse without waiting for her to speak. "He'll move the authorization files," she said, "not destroy them. Moving them is cleaner. They surface later in a form he controls. What do you need?" "Tess has to reach the correspondence room tonight, before we arrive tomorrow." He was quiet for 3 strides. "The contact route won't be fast enough. I know. If you send someone directly, I know that too." She looked ahead at the road. "It needs to be me. A larger team will be heard before they reach the correspondence room, and no one else knows the inner passages well enough to make speed matter." She expected resistance. She did not get it. "Take 1 man," he said. "Croft. He knows the territory edge and he does not talk." Croft was one of the 3. She had registered this. "I'll be back before dawn," she said. "You will," he agreed, which was not the same as a question. The pack house at night was the same pack house it had always been. The same left hinge on the kitchen gate that dragged against the stone rather than swinging clean. The same gap in the outer fence at the western edge of the yard where the posts had been replaced with timber 2 spans shorter than the original. She had not allowed herself to think too carefully during the ride about what it would feel like to move through this place again. She moved through it. Croft held position at the fence line. Orla went in alone, through the kitchen, down the servants' corridor, past the linen storage and the door that led to the upper staff rooms, and then left, through the passage that ran alongside the main hall, and to the correspondence room at the far end. Tess was already there. Crouched at the locked correspondence chest, with a thin wedge she had clearly spent several evenings fashioning from kitchen stock, working the lock with the concentrated attention of someone who had practiced this in her mind before attempting it with her hands. She looked up when Orla's shadow reached her. Neither of them spoke. Tess reached into the chest and produced a folded bundle wrapped in oilcloth. It was thicker than Orla had hoped. She took it, checked the outer page by the faint light from the hall, and found Vane's handwriting on the first document she opened. 3 signatures on the second, Vane, Davin. A third name she did not recognize. She would learn it later. She relocked the chest the way Tess had found it and pressed the bundle inside her riding coat against her ribs. She touched Tess's arm once. Tess nodded once. The wordlessness between them was the fluency of people who had operated in close proximity to danger for a long time. Orla was 3 rooms from the outer corridor when she heard the footstep. Not staff. The weight of a man who was awake because he had been stationed to be awake, not because his night had brought him here by chance. She pressed into the alcove beside the linen door and waited. He passed within 4 feet of her. She held the compression flat, deep. the wolf shoved down to the last layer. No breath, no movement, nothing that a sharp nose could find. He continued past. She counted to 20 and moved. The kitchen gate sang on its dragging hinge at exactly the note she remembered. She was through and across the yard and through the fence gap before the sound had finished. Croft was waiting. He said nothing. She said nothing. They rode back in the dark, in the kind of silence that comes from a night going better than it had any reason to. She was back at the column's camp before dawn. Harlan was awake, standing at the fire, and looked at her when she arrived with the specific expression of a man who had been doing something other than sleeping and was not going to comment on that. She handed him the bundle. He read by firelight. A long minute passed. 2. Third signature, she said. I don't have the name against a face yet. I do. His voice was flat. That is Vane's legal seal witness. A solicitor he has used for 15 years, not a council member, a private appointment. He lowered the document. This is Vane's personal record of the arrangement, not an official document, a private account, which means he kept it as insurance. Against Rolf. He looked at her over the firelight. Rolf does not know this exists. The implications of that landed in the air between them, and sat there. She had spent 2 years building a case against a man who was himself evidence against a larger one. The morning they entered Dunmore's central settlement came bright and hard with cold. The column had positioned at the edge of Dunmore's central settlement before the pack had properly risen. Harlan's arrival was simultaneous with his announcement of it, which was the point. Orla rode at the right side of the column, 2 horses from the front, watching the pack house entrance and the movement beginning at every doorway as word spread. She did not see it happen. She felt it. A shift in the air. Not the bond, something less personal. The specific change in the atmosphere of a situation that has just learned something it did not know a moment before. She looked left. A man she had not paid close attention to in the column was looking at Rolf's headman across 30 yards of open ground. The exchange had no words. It was completed in 3 seconds. The man's eyes moved to her. She held his gaze. He turned his horse. Harlan. She kept her voice low. He had already seen it. The rider went south at a pace that was not running and was therefore not catchable without open aggression on another pack's territory. They let him go. They had to. Rolf knows, she said. Yes. He will move the remaining files immediately. Yes. Harlan's jaw was set. And that is why we are already moving. The column drove forward at the pace of something that had stopped waiting for permission. Orla drove her horse with it, and the pack house rose ahead of her for the first time since the night she had climbed out of a sealed coffin and run north. They reached the main yard at a canter. She was off the horse before it fully stopped. Through the entrance, left down the inner corridor toward the restricted wing. She could hear Harlan's men at the main hall entrance, the formal announcement of the Alpha King's authority to access, the specific language of an inspection that was not asking. She was already through the inner passage. She hit the restricted archive door at a run. It was open. Inside, the authorization correspondence chest had been pulled from its fixed position and was in the arms of one of Rolf's guards, halfway to the rear window. A second man stood at the chest with a lit taper. Orla stopped in the doorway. The man with the taper looked at her. She let go. Not a decision. A recognition that the decision had already been made, that there was no version of the next 30 seconds where holding the compression served her better than releasing it. 7 years of sealed force became something else without her constructing the transition. Her wolf came forward with the full weight of everything that had been packed into too small a space for too long. The release moved outward like a wave through stone, immediate and total, and every wolf in the building felt it as authority without a name. Something the hierarchy had no category for, only the deep animal reflex to stop. The man with the taper stopped. The guard with the chest stopped. Harlan hit the doorway 3 seconds behind her. She heard every wolf in his column outside respond to what had passed through the walls, heard them still and reassess and recalibrate in the same breath. She heard Rolf's pack in the yard do the same. She heard Harlan. He did not still. He stepped into the room and placed himself at her left shoulder and faced the two men with a silence that the room filled with very quickly. "Set it down," he said. They set it down. Later she would think about the 8 seconds that followed. Him at her shoulder, the bond fully open between them for the first time, no compression to blunt it, no distance to manage it through. She would think about what it felt like to stand beside someone and feel that they had not moved away from what had just happened, that they had, in fact, moved toward it. She did not think about it then. Then she crossed the room and put her hands on the chest, and behind her, the work of the morning had already begun. The archive chest sat on the table in the main hall. Rolf stood at the far end of the room. He had been brought in 15 minutes after the column secured the pack house, and in those 15 minutes, he had not spoken and had not been spoken to. His two senior betas stood on either side, both of them reading the room with the careful attention of men deciding whether their loyalty had a price. Harlan sat at the head of the table. Orla stood to his left. The chest was opened. Document by document, the contents were laid across the table surface. Harlan's clerk worked through them at a deliberate pace. No one rushed. Each page sat in full view and was seen for what it was. The authorization records from the correspondence room lay at the top of the pile. Vane's handwriting on the draft terms, Davin's routing endorsements, the third seal from the solicitor, clean, formal, entirely explicit about what each signatory had understood they were authorizing. When the clerk set down the 43rd document, Orla kept her eyes on the table. She had known what that entry said for 7 years. Seeing it in this room, with Rolf 12 feet away, was not easier for the knowing. Harlan's hand moved across the table. He turned the document face down. Not for her. She registered the gesture and understood it for what it was. Not protection. Acknowledgement. The first beta's voice came from across the room. He told us they agreed. The second beta did not look at Rolf when he spoke. They didn't agree to any of them. Not one that I saw. Rolf said, "Careful." The second beta looked at him then. "I have been careful for 4 years. I am done with it." What followed was not dramatic. It moved with the tired weight of men reporting things they had known and not said too long. Dates, names, specific instances. One of them had been present when Orla's mother was removed from the lower yard. He described it in short, flat sentences, in the way men described things they had tried to file away and found they could not. The clerk recorded all of it. Rolf said nothing else. When the testimony concluded, Harlan rose and delivered the formal declaration in the language the Alpha King's authority required. Stripped of title, stripped of rank, stripped of the pack leadership he had held for 11 years. The language was old and specific and carried weight. Rolf received it the way small men received large verdicts, without looking at anyone directly. He was held for transport to the capital under formal guard. Vane was found in the eastern guest quarters with his coat on and his traveling bag at his feet. He received the 2 guards with the composed expression of a man who had run his calculations and arrived at acceptance as the cleanest exit. He did not speak. He did not resist. He walked out of the room between them with the posture of someone filing away the experience rather than living inside it. Orla was not present for his arrest. She was in the lower yard. She had not intended to go there. Her feet had taken her through the servants' corridor and down the 3 steps to the packed earth before she understood where she was going. The wall at the western edge, the gate to the adjoining field, the iron ring worn smooth. 2 long, pale scratches near the gate post, nearly weathered now, the shallow channels almost level with the rock surface around them. She crouched and pressed her fingers into the nearest line. The cold of the stone came through clearly. The false record existed somewhere in the capital, not yet corrected. It sat in a ledger in the handwriting of men who had made her mother's resistance into a signature. She pressed her fingers flat until the cold reached bone. Then she stood and went back inside. Tess was found in the upper servants' quarters, held under informal restriction since the column's arrival. She was sitting on the floor against the wall when Orla came through the door. She had a bruise on her forearm and a cut along her jaw from being pushed through a doorframe. She looked up. "I lost the last 3 pages," she said. "They got to the room before I finished." "We had what we needed," Orla said. Tess let out a breath. She was not a dramatic person. She accepted Orla's hand up from the floor, looked around the room as if confirming she had left nothing behind, and walked out with the manner of someone who had decided the room no longer had anything to do with her. In the yard, Harlan's healer cleaned the cut and strapped the arm. When the captain offered the formal terms of witness relocation, a new designation under the Crown's provision, housing in a neutral settlement, a support allowance for 1 year, Tess listened until he finished. "Can I choose the settlement?" she said. "Yes." "Then I accept." Before the column began its preparations, she found Orla near the horses. "You didn't leave me," Tess said. "I left you in the most dangerous place I could find," Orla said. "That's not the same thing." "No," Orla said, "it isn't." They were both poor at what came next. They had spent 2 years in a kitchen speaking around things in shorthand, and they stood in the cold yard with the wind off the eastern field, and Tess put her arms around Orla for a short, complete moment, and Orla let her. That was its own kind of record. The road to the capital took 6 days. The Sigma Declaration traveled ahead of the column under seal, delivered to the capital's record office for processing before the column arrived. It was the first formal Sigma designation registered in the capital in over 30 years. The questions it generated required 3 separate reviewers before it could be accepted. By the time Orla arrived, the questions had been answered. The false entry for her mother was formally reclassified. The correction was written in the hand of the senior record officer. Involuntary removal under unlawful contract. Victim of illegal trade. Her mother's name sat correctly in permanent record for the first time. Orla was given a copy. She read it once. Then she folded it and placed it at the bottom of her pack. Not filed away. Kept close. The capital was louder and larger than anything she had navigated since Dunmore, and she moved through it in the first days with the wariness of someone whose instincts had been calibrated to one specific environment. The rooms she was given in the administrative wing were warm and larger than anything she had occupied in 7 years. She checked the exits before she went to sleep. Old habits required time. Davin's testimony before the formal inquiry panel ran 3 sessions and extended the investigation in 2 directions she had not anticipated. There had been other operations, smaller, using the same legal framework Vane had constructed. She spent the following week in the inquiry rooms, reviewing documents and giving supplementary testimony. It was the first time she had done this work without concealing that she was doing it. That distinction was larger than she had been prepared for. On the 14th evening in the capital, Harlan found her in the inquiry records room after the session had ended. He sat across from her at the long table. The lamp between them was the only light still burning. Outside, the capital's night sounds came through the narrow window in layers. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Then ask." At the coffin. You stood there longer than made sense, in a room full of Rolf's people. The rational decision was to open the lid. She looked at him directly. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet a moment, considering rather than composing. "My wolf's response was specific," he said. "Not distress, not threat. Specific in a direction I had not felt before and had no framework for under those conditions." He paused. "Opening the lid in that room without understanding what I was responding to would have given Rolf's people information I did not want them to have. If you were alive, it would have ended you before I knew why my wolf was reacting. The only protective action available was to deny the room any signal that something was wrong. You protected a stranger without knowing why. I protected a situation I did not yet understand. That is different." She accepted this. It matched the man she had spent weeks watching operate. "What did it feel like?" she said. "Not the calculation, the moment itself." He looked at her. "Like putting my hands flat against a door and not opening it." The lamp shifted in a draft from somewhere. "The Sigma suppression," she said. "You have not asked what it costs." "No, I am going to tell you anyway." She rested her hands on the table. It requires the same mechanism as a controlled shift, every time. The effort compounds. The body does not return to neutral between uses. 7 years of it left me with a sealed pressure that I had no way to release gradually. What happened in the archive was not a skill I deployed. It was a container that had run out of room. She paused. The parts that cost more than I expected were the small ones. The wolf sensing something close and not being permitted to respond. Years of that. It changes how you move through the world, not strategically, something smaller. You stop expecting your instincts to be answered. And then they are, and you don't know what to do with that. The silence after was not empty. When I was 20, Harlan said, there was a conflict at the eastern border that lasted 14 months. I spent 11 of them making decisions I could not reverse with incomplete information. When it ended, I did not sleep correctly for almost a year. Not from what had happened, from the discontinuation of a state I had been operating in too long. The body learns a way of being, and does not release it when the reason is gone. She looked at him. I am not equating those things, he said. I am saying I understand carrying something at a cost you cannot fully account for until you set it down. The bond moved through the room with the settled weight of something that had stopped being a problem. She felt it without the resistance that had marked the weeks before. Not because it had changed in scale, but because she had stopped spending force against it. What happens next, she said. With the inquiry, all of it. The inquiry runs another 2 months. It needs the person who built the initial case. He held her gaze. Within the inquiry, formally designated. As what? That depends on what you are willing to be designated as. She looked at the window. The Capitol laid out beyond it, louder and stranger and more open than anything she had moved through in a long time. I will think about the designation, she said. That is a reasonable answer. It is not a refusal. I know what it is, he said. On the 30th day in the Capitol, Orla stood in the record office while the senior clerk read the formal entry aloud. Sigma designation, full legal standing, PAC origin, Dunmore, reclassified under inquiry resolution. Current status, under Crown administrative provision. And then her name, her full name, recorded correctly, in permanent record, under no false entry and no fraudulent classification. Not dead, not fugitive, not general staff. She listened from start to finish without looking away from the clerk's face. Is the entry accurate? He asked. Yes, she said. It is accurate. He closed the record book. She was given the copy, folded alongside the reclassified entry for her mother, both of them in the same leather cover. She carried them out into the corridor where Harlan was waiting. He read her face, did not ask anything. They walked back through the palace complex in the direction of the inquiry rooms. The bond moved through the morning between them, settled and certain, and no longer asking anything of her that she was not prepared to give. She had spent 7 years reducing herself to the kind of presence no one registered inside a place that had never been hers. The name in the record office was the first document she had ever held that belonged to what she actually was. She carried it close, both of them, the one that corrected a lie, and the one that said, for the first time, exactly who she was. And that is the end of Orla and Harlan's story. She spent 7 years becoming invisible so that the truth could finally be seen. And in the end, the only person who ever looked in the right direction was the one standing at a closed coffin, choosing to protect what he didn't yet understand. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for Orla from the very first night in that storage room, leave a comment below and let me know. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you are subscribed to Moonlight Novels. There is always another story waiting. I will see you in the next one.